presence of both the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire above what appears to be the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, you get rain. Rain that comes off of the Mediterranean and comes down, but doesn't come down in the form of monsoons, it will come down in the form of showers. Okay, let me put this together. You have people who live by herding sheep, goats, camels, right? Later horses as well. And given the nature of the pasture that exists there, the further north you go, the denser the population becomes of the so-called Bedouin peoples. Bedouin peoples live in a desert environment or an arid environment in steppe country. They reside in tents, they are highly mobile, but one thing, there is a dry season. In the dry season, what's critical, obviously, for survival is water. And so when you look at the history of the Bedouin tribes in this part of the world, struggle over wells has been one of the dominant facets of their life. But also struggle over camels. Camel raiding is part and parcel of the culture of this part of the world and has been since before Muhammad. Okay, so let me look at my notes a little bit here so I don't get lost. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. This produced a tribal way of life. What is tribalism? Tribes, we use the word tribes, right? And tribalism as a background to a discussion of Islam is critical because Islam will emerge within the context of a specific tribe, the Quraysh, which is the tribe of Muhammad. Tribalism combines a high level of individuality, personal expression, and personal security, all of which is tied to membership in a tribe. Remember, this is an area and a point in time in which there is no state-level organization of society. In the absence of the state, that means quite simply there are neither police nor courts. There is no legal jurisdiction that overrides the individual. Where does your personal security come from? It comes from membership in a tribe. And so tribalism and the identity of the individual, together with the security of the individual, is tied to that membership. This will be a major problem confronting Muhammad, who will try to create a new model, the Ummah, the community of Islam, which should override all of these lower level differences. But how can you do this unless you indeed guarantee the security of the individual and create a system that can replace the tribe in these situations? One of the things that you have amongst tribalism is something called retaliatory blood feuds. There's a book by a British anthropologist called Peace and the Feud. In this particular book, the author describes just how it is that a feud, seemingly, from our point of view, a little bit like Orientalism, right, Hannah? In the sense that we look at feuds as chaos and confusion, as the struggle of people, constant warfare. But what this author tries to show is, actually, in the absence of the state, the feud, or at least the threat and the possibility of a feud, is what indeed guarantees peace in a society that lacks the apparatus of the state. How does this work? Well, these groups keep accounts. They keep accounts with other groups. You kill a member of my group, and we are literally down one to your group, which means that we'll be looking for you to even the accounts, right? Now, the way it works is we will even the accounts if we kill not the person who performed the deed that started the actions of the feud, but any member of the group. a true collective guilt concept that holds. Seems to be rather primitive, but on the other hand, what then happens, as the author explains in the book that I had mentioned, what happens is, my brother gets into a fight with someone else. I am going to step in and stop it before it escalates. Why? Because my life could be the end result. If my brother kills that person, members of his group will come. And if they can't get my brother, they'll take me. And if they can't get my brother, they can't get me, well, maybe they'll get my cousin, right? And so it is a mechanism that helps to ensure that violence does not escalate to the point that it sort of is constant. Although it is always a possibility. Again, as I was mentioning, the group that Muhammad belongs to, a tribal group called the Quraysh, had just about the year 500, and we don't have exact dates for this because, as David mentioned, and Stephen Marizzi would also say the same thing, in the absence of true primary sources, it's really kind of hard to know exactly when these things happen. But the Quraysh, somewhere around the year 500, came in, drove out the group that was there previously, took over the city of Mecca. Mecca at this particular point in time wasn't very big. You know, if we could get into some sort of a transport device, right? Okay. If we could get into some sort of a transport device. Judy, come down here. Sit up here. This is our second speaker, and you can all be thankful that she's here. She's going to wow us.
Took me an hour from Fairfield. I Sorry.
I'll let me praise. You're here, right? Yeah, because there was in step, right? I should have watched you. Okay. All right, back again. Where was it? Okay, so the Quraysh have taken over the city of Mecca. And what they do is they start cleaning up the business of Mecca. And the business of Mecca, and Mecca is sort of in a, to be quite blunt about it, rather miserable part of the world. It's dry, dusty, it's surrounded by rocky mountains, this kind of thing. It's not the kind of place that you would choose. Okay, but in any case, Mecca had two major factors that will become important when we look at the history of Islam. The first is the fact that it was a trade node. It was a point on camel caravans offloading in Yemen. Yemen is the very south, the bottom of the Red Sea, where the Red Sea meets the Indian Ocean, right? Yemen, boats arriving there would transship shipments of spices and other kinds of things, whatever it was, and put them on camel caravans because the markets were in the north, right? And they would be sent up on these camel caravans to the northern reaches. And Mecca was about halfway up and had become the place where camel caravans came. And marketing was done there and things like that. And so it had fallen on hard times until the Quraysh came in again. One of the problems was, again, that the theme that I mentioned before, there is an absence of state organization, an absence of overarching security. When Eastern Europe, communism in Eastern Europe fell, one of the great fears of Western businessmen and women, for that matter, right? Should I say business people? Renee, is that the correct? Businessers. One of the fears was that there was an absence of clear systems of legality to protect private property, right? That the transition from a communist to a capitalist state tied to democracy did not guarantee, if you will, the security of your investments. And if you're going to put millions and billions of dollars into the creation of capital of businesses in Eastern Europe, you'll be more careful. You'll be a little bit, well, the same thing is true. Okay, I want to move a little bit more quickly so I can get into this. The second aspect, in addition to the fact that Mecca was a trading post, was the fact that it was a pilgrimage site. It was not the only pilgrimage site in Saudi Arabia, on the Arabian Peninsula, but it was an important pilgrimage site. In addition to which, during the holy month of Ramadan, there were special sort of religious sanctions against performing acts of violence during that period of time. What that meant was that Mecca then became a place in which traders could come with a certain degree of certainty that whatever outstanding debts one tribe had against another would not produce acts of vengeance in that period of time. And hence, in addition to bringing in local tribal groups along the route, which was the lack of security that I was talking about, enabled trade to grow and produce wealth. Now, capitalism, for all its good points and all its bad points, certainly one of the things that capitalism tends to do is stratify the population. Capitalism tends to produce winners and losers. Right? It may, if it's not a zero growth economy, if it's a true growth economy, may increase the wealth for all members of society, but it certainly is going to increase the wealth of some, seemingly at the expense of others, which will be the way it is viewed. The conquest of Mecca had been a true tribal conquest. With the growth of capitalism and stratification, some subdivisions called clans, and even down to the level of families, became wealthier than others. Muhammad is born into a family that is below the median, shall we say, right? It's not one of the poorest families, it's a fairly well-respected family, but it's a family that has seemingly suffered from a lack of contact with the wealth-generating mechanism that is the trade itself. Muhammad's mother is pregnant, and while she is pregnant, Muhammad's father dies. So effectively, Muhammad is born an orphan. And being born an orphan, it represents grave problems and difficulties in our own society, but in a society without the state, who steps in to pick up the slack? Well, this is a tribal society, and again, personal security is tied to membership in a tribal society. He also comes from a family that has, I think it's 9 brothers, right? It's a strong group of men tied together, right? His grandfather then takes in his mother while she's still pregnant, and Muhammad is born. And at the age of 6, his mother dies, right? He's still in his grandfather's care. He dies 2 years later. And what's going to happen is a man by the name of Abu Talib, who is his paternal uncle, will pick up the slack, right? Take Muhammad in, raise Muhammad virtually as his own son. He will later on have a son by the name of Ali, and Ali will be a critical figure in all of this because Ali is the source of the Shia Ali, the followers of Ali, the origins of the Shiite movement inside Islam. The early years of Muhammad are a bit like the years of Christ. What do we know about Christ during his first 30 years before he begins his public ministry? Well, the Gospels have here and there a few stories that may be apocryphal, we don't know, may come out of certain traditions in the Middle East at that particular point in time. We really don't know too much about Christ. We don't know that much about Muhammad, and there are a few stories that are gathered together. What, after all, can we use as sources if we're going to approach this as historians? The primary source is going to be the Quran itself. The Quran is the sacred writing of Islam, but it is very much tied to the life of Muhammad. And a close reading of the Quran can extract both theological but also political and social concerns reflected in the text at different points in time. And Western scholars have sat down and tried to correlate the writings of the Quran with events during his life. What else can we use to write about the life of Muhammad? There are something called hadith, which I'm sure you'll give us in greater detail later. But the hadith are the collected stories of either what Muhammad said or what Muhammad did during his lifetime that aren't collected for what, 150 years, something like that afterwards, right, kind of a thing. And Western scholars look at them with a grain of salt, but the people who collected them also looked at them with a grain of salt. In any case, Muhammad, at the age of 25, gets a job with a wealthy woman who's a widow. She's been married twice already, a woman by the name of Khadija. Takes a caravan north, comes back, gets excellent reports from the other members of the caravan. She asks him if he'd like to get married. He agrees. So here you have, we look at the misogyny of Islam. Here is we're not going to say wealthy, but a well-to-do woman, successful businesswoman, right, who asks the man to marry him, and he agrees. Was it a marriage of convenience? Maybe yes, maybe no, but from all accounts, it was a very, very close, loving relationship, monogamous during the period of time that Muhammad is married to her. Her death will be one of the crosses, if you will, to use a metaphor from a different religious tradition, one of the crosses that Muhammad will have to face in his own life, right? Muhammad apparently was a person of a certain spiritual temperament, was looking for answers. The Arabian Peninsula at this particular point in time had Jewish communities, but the Jews themselves were in the process of formulating the modern Torah as we know it. There were scholars working on it in different parts of the world, right? There were also Christian communities. As David Lincoln indicated in his talk this morning, there were varieties of Christianity out there, and sometimes being a Christian didn't always cut it with other Christians if you believe one thing or another. They were also surrounded by the Persian Empire, where they practiced Zoroastrianism, Zarathustra, right? 8th, 7th century BC, and we're not even sure the actual age, who introduces in the dialogue of Western religions the concept of heaven and hell. In fact, he took it to the point where the forces of good are fighting the forces of evil, and who knows what the final outcome will be. Sounds a little bit like Star Wars, right? But it has an immense influence because he creates the image of a hell and the fires of hell for those who do not fight on the side of the good. In any case, Muhammad is searching. And in his own city of Mecca, the Kaaba, a pilgrimage site that people came to, apparently was dedicated originally to Allah. And of course, in Arabic, the word Allah means God. But it was the high god of a pantheon of gods there. There were something like 360 statues in the areas surrounding the Kaaba that people from other tribes could come to, make offerings, pray, right, this kind of thing, and do their religious thing while they were there. Wow. Okay, so in the year 610, Muhammad is off in meditation in Mount Hira, in a cave where apparently he went to get out of the hot of the summer months. The angel Gabriel, Jibril in Arabic, will come to him and tell him to recite. His response is, what should I recite, right? And the angel Gabriel then puts his arms around him. Is it a dream? Is it a vision? What it is again? Muhammad himself is not really sure. But he faints, comes to, and the words of the angel are on his mind. He goes to see his wife and tells her that he thinks he's going crazy. And his wife says, you're not crazy. Everyone knows you're sane. She goes to visit a cousin who's a Christian. And when he hears the story, he says, that sounds like Old Testament prophecy. I think you've been visited by a true angel, and you should follow the commands. You cannot escape from it. It will follow you wherever you go. Muhammad then gathers a small group of about 5 people, Ali, Khadija, Abu Bakr, a few others, an initial group, and for 3 years, remember Christ's public ministry was 3 years, for 3 years, he slowly receives messages, reveals them to his closest followers, but doesn't begin the practice of talking about them to others. Okay. Give me about 5 more. After 3 years, he begins preaching to his fellow Qurayshis. And of course, a prophet is never recognized amongst his own people. They begin laughing at him, throwing things at him, right, debating with him in public and things like that. It will get to the point where it is actually dangerous. In the year, let me see, whatever, I don't have that table with me, but after about 7 years or so, maybe 617, something like that, 616, 615, he sends a group of followers to Abyssinia, to the kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia, to get them away from the dangers that present themselves to him. One of the things that Muhammad is going to do is he's going to insist on extreme monotheism, which Dr. Greeley will really explain much better than I am right here. An extreme monotheism that denies the existence, validity, and truth of the other gods that these other people believe in, right? And it's a form of, you might say, intolerant, but it's an extreme form of monotheism that says we cannot exist with other gods here present, claiming to be true gods, when we know there is only one God. Muhammad will base some of his assertions on the pre-existing monotheistic traditions, right? Very quickly, in political terms, what's going to happen is Muhammad will be forced out of Mecca, moved to what is an oasis town, Yathrib, which will be renamed Medina al-Nabi, the town, the city of the prophet. He goes there and he becomes the political ruler of that particular town, fights caravans out of Mecca to give his people something to do, some way of eating, this kind of a thing. Eventually conquers Mecca, comes back as a conquering hero. The Meccans are forced to lay down their arms, they convert to Islam. And Mecca and Medina then, with the Kaaba at the center, become, if you will, the two holy cities of Islam. There's obviously a lot more to be said, but I'm going to stand aside for Dr. Greeley, who's put together a really nice presentation and who needs to get her stuff up here.
Happens to Islam after the death of the Prophet in 632. And I should say that I'm going to be approaching this as a student and a scholar of religious studies. So it's very descriptive. This is not proscriptive. So for all of my Muslim brothers and sisters out there, I'm simply going to share some stories about Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, a little bit of Sufism. I know we have another speaker for that. And just give you a sense of what happens when we talk about religion and the natural ways in which human beings just can't seem to all get along, as someone once said. So the first thing I would like to just share with you is that after the death of Muhammad, there was a sense that during his time and just after it, there was what was known as the Ummah. And that's simply the community of believers. And every religion has that sense of a community of believers. And if there were two things that we could really focus on besides the prophet, and I don't have an image of him, but you can appreciate that his role as the revelation and as the one who brought the revelation to the people was central. Of course, the most important material for that would be the Holy Quran. And you know, were we to spend a lot of time on that, we could talk about the ways in which it was, you know, sort of gathered together. But as your professor said to you before, it really took, you know, a good long time for all those revelations to come, and they were sort of put into a text, which if some of you have read, is a very distinctive kind of text. And I don't want to go too long into this, but just to share with you that whenever someone says to you that the Quran is like the Bible, yes, it is, in the sense that it's like the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, or any of the holy texts. But when you actually dip into the Quran, you'll see that its rhetoric is very, very different. It doesn't read like a story. It doesn't read like a biography. It doesn't read like a poem. It reads like a conversation. And so one of the things you have to remember is when you read the Quran, the Holy Quran, you don't just sort of jump into it the way, you know, you see two friends talking, you walk up and you're in the middle of a conversation, you're like, I don't even know what's going on. So the idea of the Quran is that you really want to sort of begin at the beginning, the way you would with any conversation. But the fact that it's a conversation, or it's kind of a monologue actually, it's a divine monologue, is that it really is Allah speaking to us, speaking to the Prophet, speaking to us. And so like anything else, there's kind of that first read, the first time you're talking to someone, you're getting a sense of what's going on, but then you have to sort of rethink it and sort of go back, and what is that what he said before? Is that what she said before? So there's a lot of work that goes into sort of understanding Quran that is not just sort of jump in, read a few passages, and there you have an understanding of it. Most Muslim scholars, both in the Middle East and Far East and even in, of course, Western, would say that the notion of redacting, or the notion of interpreting Quran is part of its tradition, which I'm going to get into a little bit later, although as we'll see there is a school of thought that says, as it is, so it is, and sort of a sola scriptura approach. But if we were to say there is, besides the Prophet himself, something very focal about the Ummah, all Muslims, regardless of Shia, Sunni, Sufi, Ismaili, any of them, of course the Quran would be the center. And the idea that there is a community, the idea that Islam is universal, the idea that we are sort of all gathered together, all peoples in this community, is still very central to the thinking. It's just the way in which sometimes that's expressed. So I don't know if you've studied Islam, I don't know if you know a lot about it, I don't want to belabor it too much because there are lots of other things to talk about. But of course, the idea that is fundamental if you are just beginning to think about Islam are what are called the 5 pillars. And I wanted to begin with this, A, because again, regardless of the sect or the denomination or the separate group, there is an understanding that these 5 pillars are sort of fundamental. It's sort of like saying if you're going to be Jewish, you probably just recently celebrated Yom Kippur or had some sense of the Day of Atonement, or you have some understanding of the history of Israel. There's some basic realities. Now, when we get to the Shahada, there is a slight issue there between two groups, but the idea that in order to be a Muslim, there are these sort of 5 observances is something that is very true for all the traditions. The Shahada, as we'll see, is simply, well, it's not simply, it's the creed. It's the creedal statement of what it is to be a Muslim. This is where a lot of stuff happens between Sunni and Shia, as we'll get to. But the idea that it's a creedal faith, there is something once in your life, you should say that expresses publicly your belief. Again, all Muslims, regardless of sex, would agree with that. It's just some of the language might change. The second of the pillars is, of course, Salat. This is also going to be something a little distinctive between 2 major groups, but the idea that you break that contrary to how we would think of it, we might say we break up our day to stop and pray, Sunni 5 times a day, Shia 5, sometimes 3 times a day. Muslims would actually probably say just something a little bit obvious. It's sort of like an inverse, and say, no, my day is prayer, and in between prayer I work or I go to sleep or I see my family, that sort of thing. Prayer is fundamental to the Muslim experience. When we get to Sufism, and again, I know someone's going to be speaking on it, so I don't want to intrude too much on that, but I did want to mention that if we were to sort of really focus on what it is to be a Sufi, it is a life of prayer. It is a life of devotion and prayer. So these are the 2 pillars. Now, the pillars aren't exactly in alpha order, but there is a sense that, you sort of have to have the creed, you have to sort of say what it is you believe, and then your prayer, which is your personal and intimate experience of God in your life. There's an ummah, and there's obviously a community of prayerful Fridays, is the day of sort of the gathering of the faithful in the mosque, and there's the major prayer, and there's usually some kind of a sermon of a sort, or a reading, or a teaching by the imams. But there's also in Islam this amazingly beautiful focus on private prayer, personal prayer. And if you've ever been to a mosque, you can go into and see a prayer room, and while there'll be 5 or 6 or 7 men perhaps, sort of all praying in the same space, they're together, bless you, they're together, but they're also very intimately separate, and they're in their own personal prayer space. And this is something that I think Muhammad was particularly keen on, his own experience being a life of mystical prayer. And the other 2 pillars, of course, there is zakat. And zakat is simply almsgiving. And I'm sure if any of you have a religious tradition, that's something familiar, the giving of charity. The interesting thing, of course, and again, this will be true for all the denominations, all the sects of Islam, the notion of whether it's 2.5%, 5%, 10%, 50%, a tithing, whatever it is, the notion that as a community, as the Ummah, as the community of believers, we should be willing to take some of our money, and we should be willing to give it to, usually it's to the mosque, there's a group of individuals who maybe are sort of the business people of the mosque, and they will distribute the money accordingly. Although, of course, it can be something other than money. It could be food, it could be lots of ways of giving zakat, giving charity. But the idea that it's something very sort of fundamental to being a Muslim, if any of you have a Christian tradition of tithing every year or tithing every month, that's very much a part of that same idea. Most religions have that. And the idea that, the reason I chose that picture, just because I like the idea of the notion that, we together as a community help each other grow. And, again, it's sometimes it's more difficult if you come from a poorer community, but I've known people who live in fairly constrained circumstances, and yet, when it's time, they put together some change and they give some money. And it is a beautiful way of kind of sharing together, sort of getting through the stuff of life. Shvam, or the idea of fasting, we've just finished the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is 30 days, 30 nights, give or take, when Muslims believe it is a moment of a time of fasting for several reasons. One, it is to celebrate the reception of the Quran by the Prophet Muhammad, but it's also a time to be reflective of all the blessings that one has and all those people who don't have blessings. And the notion that, for example, you fast from, well, we'd say like from sunrise to sunset, technically it's from the time that you can discern a white thread from a black thread to the time you cannot discern a white thread from a black thread. And the idea of fasting is not just fasting from food. That's, of course, a major component of it. To be mindful of those people who don't fast every day, they're just hungry every day. To be mindful of the fact that there's food, after this, if you're really hungry, most of us hopefully will be able to go out there and grab something to eat, and there are a lot of people who don't have that. But it's also fasting from lots of other impulses that separate us from God. And so when a Muslim fasts, for example, and if it's a very observant Muslim, they will fast both in terms of food and also water. Then there's additional fasting. You fast from sex for the 30 days, 30 nights. You fast from anger. You fast from gossip. You fast from vulgarity. And it's really a kind of discipline. In some traditions, they call it a kind of spiritual discipline that asks you for that month to be reflective of not just the blessings one has, but all the things that keep you from God, all the things that keep you from your spiritual center. So if we spend a lot of time in anger with each other, we spend a lot of time lusting, it's kind of like the 7 deadly sins, right? We spend a lot of time being greedy, then we spend a lot of time sort of focusing in on ourselves. And the idea, of course, is that with that month of Ramadan, it should happen all year, of course, but with that 1 month, it's kind of a dedicated time. And it's actually enjoined upon everybody over the age pretty much of puberty, although I've known little children, about 8 or 9, also to engage in a form of fasting. And obviously there's certain circumstances, pregnant women, older people, anybody with a health condition is not required to fast in quite the same way that perhaps a robust young college students would be all expected to fast. But the idea is it's not so much you must do these 5 or 6 things to fast, is that you're conscious of the importance of fasting, you're conscious of the time. There's always a celebration, the great Eid, right, our Eid, the idea of, at the end of it, there's a joyful kind of food and family celebration. But it's just to be aware that, by denying oneself a little something, whether it be monetary, material goods, or whether it be something like, just not letting your anger get the better of you. As I was driving here behind traffic and I didn't know why, and I was getting furious, I said, okay, I just calm down, take it easy. So anyway, the idea is also that it makes one more prayerful. Ideally, if you're fasting that month, the hope is that you would be sort of spending time in reflection and contemplation, not unlike during the Sabbath day when observant Jews, for example, spend time in shul and then they go and pray and with family. It's that sense of just being a little bit more prayerful and spiritual. And then the final dimension of the 5 pillars is, of course, the Great Hajj, the Great Pilgrimage. And again, all the sects, the groups I'm going to be talking about, all of them would agree that the Great Hajj to Mecca, which your professors talk so eloquently about, is really fundamental. Now, one need only do this once in one's lifetime, although there certainly are people who've done it 2 or 3 times. It's such an important dimension to one's experience of being a Muslim, and again, whether Sunni, Shia, Sufi, whatever it is, that in fact, one is given a title, a Haji. There's a way in which you become honored if you do this pilgrimage, and it's meant to be taken extremely seriously. I have many Muslim friends who are, in a position in their lives, they probably could go. It's usually about a 3-week stay in Saudi Arabia. unfortunately, there's, been some troubles recently with us, too many people and not enough guards, and stampedes and things like that, because thousands and thousands and thousands of people go. I love this picture because it can show you the numbers of people there. But many people will say, I'm just not spiritually ready for it yet. I have to be prepared to spend these, give or take 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, in the sort of way in which pilgrimage is asking them to sort of rethink their lives. Pilgrimage is sort of that spiritual journey, right, that again, many religions have this, where we move from a place of where we are to a new place. We seek transformation. Most of the time that transformation is internal, and eternal, somewhat spiritual. And the idea, of course, is also to honor all the various stories. So whether it's going to the great center of Mecca, which of course, as you just heard, is the center of all of Islam, whether it's looking, sort of reminding oneself of the Zamzam well, where Hajar and her son Ishmael were seeking water after being kicked out by Sarah and Abraham, and then water suddenly appearing, whether it's sort of throwing stones at an object that's going to represent the devil, so throwing stones at the devil and then trying to kill the devil within you, even within you. It's a very powerful and emotional experience. And if you ever go on YouTube, I always tell my students to find YouTube. There recently have been several YouTube films done by Muslims who have gone through the actual pilgrimage and posted them. And it's an amazing journey. And again, it's one of these sort of wonderful sort of correlations where you have the individual and you have the community. So there's the great ummah, but then you have, and one reason I chose this picture, but you also have your own solitary experience. And again, the great faiths of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have this kind of correlation with this, so the individual and there is the community, and one sort of feeds into the other, one sort of helps the other. So those 5 pillars would be true for all the different sects, all the different groups we'll be talking about.
Before you remove that, go back
Sure.
there for 1 second. Indicate to the students the Kaaba,
Okay.
because this is something they should know,
Right there.
But this particular picture sort of
It's so
puts it in the
small, it's
context
actually-
of what the Saudis have done with their wealth
Right,
to
now-
create this massive,
Right, I should say, and I didn't know how much this you would already have, but I should say a couple things. One is, and I'll just throw this out there, this great mosque that's at the center of Mecca, in the center of the Hajj, was built by the Bin Laden family, so just to put that out there. And also, it isn't a good picture for that sense, but the Kaaba is massive. Now, what it is, I don't know if any of you have studied this, but what it is, again, most descriptively, as best we can tell, is a very large meteorite, a black stone, that has probably been there since the time of the pre-Islamic world, okay, the time of ignorance, as it's called, the time before Islam, and has just kind of been there. And there was always a kind of celebration around that, this big, massive stone sitting there. Of course, there'd be some way of celebrating that. With the tradition that then Muhammad brought in, and he kind of transformed what had been to something new, or to rethink it, or to sort of re-understand it, the Kaaba itself then was put into sort of this, I guess you could call it a box, for lack of a better word. And it's hard to see, and I wish I could give you a better picture, but you can see the black there, that's all black velvet. And so it's this incredibly ornate piece of cloth, tapestry that kind of covers it. And the gold you see around there is actually script that comes from Quran. I'll mention, in case some of you don't know, of course, Islam, like Judaism, really holds dear the idea that there should be no graven images. The Shia are going to have some issues with that, which we'll get to. But the idea that you really do not show pictures of God or saints or famous people, and that you simply, if you have to adorn anything with anything, well then adorn it with the sacred script of Quran, which is one of the reasons why calligraphy becomes so important in the tradition of Islam. Okay, so that's kind of the general way of thinking about the Ummah. Now, what I wanted to say, and I don't want to give you a lesson in religious studies, but I just wanted to mention that there has never been a religion that has not somehow found its way into being compartmentalized, separated, denominationalized, sectarian. It seems that we human beings just can't sort of leave well enough alone. And this is true of all religious traditions. Founded religions tend to have this issue more than others. And by that I mean a religion that has a sort of figure who comes into historical time, whatever else you think about the person, comes into historical time and presents him or herself as a kind of voice, as a kind of center of this teaching, whether through revelation, whether through new understanding, and so on. And oftentimes it's that individual who forms the real core, as you heard, of course, the new way of thinking, new way of understanding. As that new core develops, the role of that founder the role of that central figure, whether it's Buddha, whether it's Jesus, maybe Paul, but whether it's or Muhammad, is obviously very central. And it's good, and it works that way. Then the person is no longer there, however your religious traditions you dies, resurrected, leaves, whatever your belief is. And what happens? And it's almost a given, and actually I did quote a little bit from Quran, I didn't know if that was okay, but I want a little bit from Quran, that even said it's going to fall apart. It's just going to fall apart. Human beings just have a tendency to sort of say, oh, no, we understand what he really meant. Oh, no, we know what she was really talking about. Now, this is true of all religions. So if I were to talk, for example, about something like Judaism, which isn't really a founded religion in the pure sense, it's kind of this religion that had obviously been, several famous people associated with it, but it's always been sort of there among the people and in the land. Certainly there are different, there's Reconstructionists, there's Orthodox and so on. There are different groups that sort of emerge how to express their Judaism. Christianity, we don't need to say, right? It's just, there's first the church separated into two, then it's separated into two broke into four, then four broke into about 15. So there are always going to be these breaks, and Islam is no different, all right? So that the idea that somehow, well, if it were religion, why don't we just stay together? Generally speaking, what happens is that the individual has sets of revelations, has sets of teachings, the hadith, which you heard about. There are a lot of times where people would go to Muhammad and say, so, you're talking about this, I don't even know what you mean by that. And he'd say, well, this is something for you to think about. And there'd be these sort of collected stories. They're almost like, they're not midrash, but they're almost just like these collected, the sidebar talks where Muhammad was trying to explain what he thought was going on with some of his revelations. And whether or not they're valid or not, I think as your professor mentioned to you, they are for many Muslims absolutely fundamental. Not as important as Quran, but certainly very, very important. The hadith, along with what's called the sunnah, which is sort of the life of the prophet, the story of the prophet, the life and style of the prophet, become sort of important ways of understanding what it is to be a Muslim. But even with all that, there are going to be people after the central figure is gone who'll say, I know what he was trying to say. I know the truth of that. And then another person will say, oh, no, I know what he was trying to say. While there is that core set of beliefs, we just talked about the pillars, things like the Quran, the Sunnah, and so on, there are going to be these sort of breakaway groups. We're going to emphasize one thing over another. So to say that Sunni and Shia, okay, this is not to offend anyone if anyone is either, that they're both Muslim. Sufi is Muslim in many of the same ways we just talked about. But there will be some in one camp or another who will say that other camp has, corrupted the teaching, or doesn't know what the true meaning is, or has misunderstood, or has fallen away, or is too worldly, or anything like that. Sufis in particular get this a lot. So in the teachings, as I said, when Revelation, this is Quran 21, this is Surah, one of the revelations said in the time of Muhammad, truly this ummah of yours is a single ummah, I am your Lord and cherisher, serve me no other. But later generations cut off their unity, they will all return to us. So even during Muhammad's time, and he was aware of this, there was going to be a break. There was going to be a way in which people were just not going to agree, and whether it had to do with how something was to be interpreted, whether it had to do with how someone was going to lead the group, whether the ummah, whether it had to do with where they should go. Sometimes those can be small matters, sometimes they can be huge matters, and because they can be huge matters, groups break up. So after the death of the Prophet, what happens is that there is a way in which the story of Islam follows a lot of other religious traditions. There are groups that, in the Arabic it would be Islam, who keep to the ways of life, keep to kind of an orthodoxy, keep to sort of, this is how it was done then, we're going to do it this way, and we're going to stay very firm that way. Now, even that can sometimes be questioned, because after about 3 or 4 generations, well, we weren't there, how do we know that's how it was done? But there's a sense of sort of keeping to the very orthodox, traditional ways. We're not going to really, change from that. However, there's also in Islam an understanding of tajid, which is this sense that, yeah, but it's a process, and it's one thing to be in 7th century Arabia. It's a whole other thing to be in 20th century Massachusetts, right? So that's where I'm from, that's why I mentioned it. So the idea is, of course, that there was also an understanding, and even the prophets talked about this, that sure, sometimes, you look at some things and you might have to sort of think a little bit in terms of where and who was involved, especially generations beyond, but not with a sense of really overcompensating and really changing it. And some people would say that's exactly what happened. There was also, in the case of Islam, very early on, even more so than Christianity, and you've heard about this, so I don't want to go into too much, but there was this sort of rapid expansion. I mean, Islam kind of begins in this sort of little, I don't want to say backwater, but let's face it, it's a big desert, and it's in Saudi Arabia, and it sort of begins there, and then within really a few generations, and for historians, you can count the time better than I, but it really begins to emerge into lots of different areas, and not just in the Middle East, and I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind. That just as Christianity, for example, moved from being a Hebraic tradition that was really stuck in that area we today call Israel or Palestine, once it hit, went into places like Greece and Rome, the language changed, some of the focus changed, a lot of things began to change because the people were different. Their language, their rhetoric, their understanding was different. How they, understood some words was going to have to be sort of rethought. And that happened over a period of time, but certainly in Islam, you have movement from what we call today the Middle East, because if I were there, it'd be the center, but we call it the Middle East, and then it just kind of merged into all of these different regions. And so there were new groups in terms of racial, ethnic, class, cultural context, all these different kind of externals that, we should understand would have to have some impact on the tradition, have some way of, either refocusing or changing, or new questions being asked. There might have been questions, let's say, when it eventually got to, let's say, Indonesia, or India or Indonesia, questions asked of some of the teachings that might never have been a question, let's say, in Mecca. And there might have been ways in which, men and women who were of a lower class in places like Central Asia might have responded to some of the teachings in a way that perhaps would not have been true in the Middle East, or not. But the fact that it had a lot of mobility meant that it was almost a given that things were going to sort of, things were going to change. And then in terms of just looking generally, I just want to go some modern, then I'll get to some of the specific sects, and please let me know my time is up. There also, for Islam, have always been historical tensions. And that goes back to whether one is of the school of we keep to the strict, we keep to the observant, we keep to the idea of the very orthodox, or whether one is going to be a little bit more sort of part of the renewal of the world around them. And for contemporary Islam today, there are sort of little splinter groups breaking off of little splinter groups. Some of the issues around this Islam as it emerged into other countries. Then you had the rise of nationalism. So when you get to something like the Ottoman Empire, which I know is already talked about, but are you Turkish, are you Muslim? Is there an Islam of Turkey, that's a Turkish Islam that's going to be a little bit different from the Islam of, let's say, Morocco? It's part of the empire, or Algeria, or something like that. And so these national tensions can become somewhat problematic. And then there was a way in which, well, am I a Turk or am I a Muslim? Or is it to be a Turk is to be a Muslim? And nationalism begins to be kind of an ongoing issue. The rise of things like, and I'm sure you've heard, the secularism and liberalism and questions that were never being asked, and all of a sudden religion like Islam hits some of the Western way of thinking, which has a very distinctive understanding in its own way of what is a good government, what's how men and women should act, and so on. So these are other kinds of factors that might really impinge on some of the actual teachings. So a way in which, generally speaking, Islam responded to some of these changes. There were, in the primary tradition, which is the Sunni tradition, which I'll get to in a moment, there were four schools of sort of law, sort of four schools of thinking, four schools of sort of theological schools. I didn't put the names on because I didn't think it would interest any of you. But there's sort of the four primary ways of sort of theologically understanding what is true of Islam and what is not true of Islam. And what ends up happening is that there again become these two ways of even looking at the law. So not just sort of looking at what is to be a Muslim following the Prophet's form, but how do we respond to these theological schools? One is called taqlid, which is just sort of blind imitation. If it says to do it, you do it. Don't even ask. If it says not to eat, oranges with pears, don't do it. And you don't even ask why. You just sort of blindly follow, and it's considered by some to be the appropriate way to do it. The other, of course, is this idea of ijtihad, this idea of independent reasoning. And this becomes really one of the more powerful strains of Islam that give rise to a lot of sense, where people are saying, well, I'm a Muslim, and I believe that this is true, and this is true. But I'm really thinking about what this was written in, this was being talked about 200 years ago. Maybe we need to reason it out a little bit differently today based on our life circumstances and so on. What happens then is that you develop two strains, and there are going to be some modernist thinkers who will say even the Quran, even the Holy Quran needs to be read. Creative is probably not the best word, but certainly needs to be read with an analytical eye, which is not in any way to deny the truth that this is the teaching of Allah. But when we say that God is speaking to us, the modernists would say, wait a minute, how can we claim to know what God is saying on a literal level, right? I mean, how can we not want to do some interpretation, some rethinking, or some way of understanding it? This, of course, becomes very important in understanding the concept of jihad, because jihad, of course, has sort of many layers of meaning, and what Muslims sort of understand to be the primary, which is this sort of the internal struggle within the self, has been read by some others as being more the defense against the infidel, who is the infidel, well, the people of the book. That also gets talked about. So this notion that there might be ways in which even as sacred a text as Quran could have levels of meaning, which some of the original schools of theological law agreed with, becomes an important response. However, the ulema, and this would be sort of the more traditional orthodox thinkers, would say that in fact, Islam is in danger, even with that kind of thinking of maybe being a little bit more creative and interpretive, of being Christianized, and Christianized not in the sense that all of a sudden Muslims become Christian, but Christianized in the sense of the deep tradition of redacted criticism and interpretation of scripture that started in the 19th century. And that along with other Western concepts are very, very dangerous. In and of themselves, they can stay in the West, and that's fine, but they have nothing to do with this singular truth that has come out of the Quran, which the ulama would say, for better or worse, is to be read literally. And so those kinds of interior tensions, even within one sect. So when we start talking about some of them, the first, of course, the most well-known is the Sunni school of Islam. Now this is, for those of you who don't know, you probably know this, but about 87% of all Muslims in the world are of the Sunni sect, I guess is the best way to put it. And this is a sect that, as I said here, is the line of Abu Bakr, which I'll explain in just a moment. But I wanted to mention that here's the Shahada, here is the creedal statement that Sunni Muslims believe is the absolute truth. I witness there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Done and dusted. Very straightforward, very simply stated, although it has very profound meanings, obviously. When we talk about the idea there is no God but Allah, go into that radical monotheism, there was a time in the history of, very early in the history of studying Islam, when there was even some thought that perhaps the first revelations might have been a kind of, not a return to Judaism, but a return to a kind of radical monotheism that Christianity had sort of corrupted, and this, with the Trinity. And so this idea that there is just a singular God has resonance in Judaism, but in Islam, that the power of that is fundamental to understanding the absolute omnipotence and omniscience and the singularity of Allah. And the notion that Muhammad is the messenger, is a prophet, is a rasul, that this is a revelation, this is a revelatory religion. Not unlike Judaism and Christianity, okay? Not unlike, the Eastern traditions are not. But in Judaism and Christianity, there are prophets, and there's no reason not to have that connection. But Sunni Muslims are those who had a very clear understanding that at the death of the prophet, so here's what we come to where there are always people getting in the way of the religions. So who was to follow the prophet? Right? You have Muhammad, you have this revelation, and he dies. And remember, for Muslims, Muhammad is not divine, he's a human being. He dies a human death. Now what? Now, it'd be nice to say, gee, he had a will, it was in the back pocket, you know, his daughter Fatima said, oh, I've got the will, it's all set here. Didn't quite happen that way. As a matter of fact, well, I should say that some Shia would say there were things said before, but in any event, there was no clear statement that said absolutely he should follow. So one school of thought, and this is the Sunni, in following the idea of Sunnah, following the life of the Prophet, believed that the rightful successor should be the first successor, and then it sort of follows, his greatest friend, his greatest companion, whose name was Abu Bakr, and he happened also to be the father of Muhammad's last wife, Aisha. And Abu Bakr was a traditional figure in the sense that he was a wise man, he was a good man, he was an elder in the tribe, he was someone who had been with Muhammad almost from the beginning, had been very stalwart in his support. And so there was a whole group who said, this is the individual who should follow the prophet. And he was at that time called a Khalifa or a Caliph, right? And I wanted to just call your attention to this because this is sort of an important way of thinking about it. For those who follow this idea of so that Abu Bakr and so the Sunni tradition, they did not feel that anyone could sort of come after Muhammad who was like him. And so you don't, the next leader, the subsequent sort of head of the Ummah, did not have to be, have prophetic abilities or have a kind of charismatic sort of revelation. That just by believing was enough, just by sort of understanding the truth was enough. Now that's not to say there haven't been Sunni leaders who have not been prophets or had revelation, but that was not considered as important as, for this school of thinking, and again, this is just, I'm just describing now, I don't want to offend anyone, but I just want to describe, that this would be essentially a way of almost returning to some of the more institutional understanding that had been in the desert with the tribes, and the idea that the desert, the tribal leaders were always these individuals, the Qadis, who were sort of these wise men, usually the head of the household, usually had a sense of understanding that was broader, it's more sagacious than those around him, and was the person to whom everyone would go. So they felt that Abu Bakr and people like him would be the natural successors. No one could replace the prophet, no one could replace Muhammad, and so the Abu Bakr could be entrusted with the teachings and helping the Ummah sort of, gain its place. Although by this time, as your professor had told you, they had pretty much settled into Mecca and Medina and so on, but there was still some other issues around. The idea then became that there would be subsequent caliphs, and these caliphs would be usually either voted on or picked or selected, or would sort of emerge from that point on. They would be rightly guided. These would be sort of the individuals you just knew they had sort of a spiritual understanding, and they would have shown manifest success. Now, whether we call the expansion of Islam, expansion or manifest success, these would be individuals who, let's say, with Abu Bakr, had shown prowess, had shown ability. So for this group of individuals, it was really important to sort of maintain that sort of almost historical tradition that was part of, was part of Muhammad's life as well. I mean, he was a member of that tribe. And so they then developed from that, well, okay, so Abu Bakr says, that's fine, but I'm no theologian. I don't have these revelations. So out of that, they developed this thinking there'd be a fiqh, which is a school of religious jurisprudence. Not quite like the schools of law, of religious law, those sort of starting that. So the manifest success was there. I'm sure you've already heard about this, but there's the emergence that, with this group of leaders, there were certainly, movements into many countries, into India, of course, the great Ottoman Empire, and of course, we'll talk a little bit about what happens with Iran. But then out of that, there emerged many sort of smaller sects and denominations over the course of time. And probably the most, one you're perhaps most familiar with are the Wahhabis. Now, Wahhabi and his teachings and 19th century Arabia is like a whole other conversation. But just so you know, when we talked a little bit earlier about the idea that even with the beginning of Islam, there was an understanding that there would always be sort of renewal or rethinking or kind of a revisiting what were some of the teachings. Well, Wahhabi was of a school that was a very, very almost puritanical desire to return to some of the orthodox teachings. And his relationship with the House of, well, this is another history thing, but with the House of Saud and how that got involved being sort of the form of Islam in Arabia, not bad or good, not adjudicating it, simply to say that it has its own particular sort of take. And this is the group that probably has the most hostility towards the Shia, even though Sunni and Shia are sort of at odds with each other, and are particularly combative against Sufis and the Sufi tradition. I know I have to hurry this. Okay. So anyway, I just want to give you a sense of sort of how the Sunni tradition, you can see here a map. I know all you historians love maps. Back in the day I was a historian, I'm a medievalist, but not a historian. But anyway, so you can see that it's just this amazing movement. So you go from Turkey, but then you're going, and this is actually not the entire thing. All over the world, you notice that the Ottoman Empire moves up into what today we call the Balkans. For those of you interested in historical context, some of the issues around what happened with Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia and all of that ties in with that. So I just want you to see that this idea that, well, these must be good leaders because look where they're taking us. They're taking us into all those parts of the world. Manifest success, rightly guided. So this must be what it is. The other empire I want to give you a sense of was, of course, the Mughal Empire in India, where Muslims sort of came in. And it was an interesting way in which they balanced their religious beliefs, but they assimilated in a way that was sort of interesting to a lot of, it's been interesting to a lot of us who study religious traditions. Of course, India is primarily a Hindu faith, and so while they did not adopt the Hindu faith, there was a kind of relaxing of some of the more traditional desert ways. And so you can see this amazing, the art that comes out of Mughal India is just phenomenal. I recommend you go online and just look at some of it. But you can see that it is fairly representative. So there are faces, there are bodies. Remember I told you before that originally Islam said no images. Mughal India was a little bit, some of the Persian influence and some of the Hindu influence.
Okay, we really have to wrap it
Wrap it
up
up?
because
Okay,
we
okay.
want to give students.
Okay,
a chance
so
to ask
then we have the idea of the Shiism, the line of Ali. And here's the real break. So what happens is that Abu Bakr and his group assume kind of authority or presence, but then there was a whole secondary group. And the other group said, no. The followers that should come after the Prophet should be from his bloodline, almost should have some of his sort of his energy, some of his charisma. And so they then said, so our followers, this group then said, we don't want Abu Bakr, we want his cousin and son-in-law Ali. And Ali, who was someone who was very charismatic, and like Abu Bakr, had been there since the beginning, had been actually saved the Prophet's life a couple of times, that becomes then the school, a secondary sect that you'll find primarily, it's only about 50% of the population, and you'll find primarily in places like Iraq and Iran. And here is the Shahada that comes out of the Shiite school, okay? Shia means the line of Ali. There's no God except God. Muhammad's the messenger of God, no problem. Then they add, Ali is the wali of God. Ali is kind of the soldier for God, voice for God. And it's that little addition that really begins to break between the Sunni and the Shia. I don't have time to go through all of this, but just so you can see, the Shia tend to also experience Islam in a fairly distinctive way. They accept all the teachings we've already talked about. They do believe that Muhammad was the prophet, of course, but they also believe that at certain places, at certain times, that Muhammad, the prophet, had indicated he wanted Ali to be his successor. Again, that's just the conversation that Shia have. And the belief was that that Muhammad had a certain kind of charism, and thus not the rightful companions, but the people of the household should be the ones who would lead that particular sect. There were several. Okay.
Okay, I give students a chance to do well.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Marvelous. Overload of information, too much information. Do you wake up tonight screaming? Question, yes.
Well, it's because you didn't get to it, but I really, because you didn't get to the Shia, what's the main difference?
Yeah, briefly, yes.
The main difference between the Sunni and Shia begins with the idea that you had a long-standing belief in who should lead the Ummah. And with the Shia, it wasn't even just that, because actually the fact that Ali was not chosen as the next caliph, and that the Shia, those who sort of supported Ali, allowed the next couple of caliphs to be part of the Abu Bakr line and Uthman and some others. But then there was sort of this tremendous battle that happened where the grandson of Ali is murdered, and the scandal of it and the fact that Muslims should set upon Muslim really kind of broke these two worlds. And so what ends up happening is that those who followed Ali's line then said, well, if you're willing to do this, we're going to sort of, have our own way of understanding who are the, there's a whole belief that they're going to be the 12 great imams. And these imams would be not just sort of political leaders of the community, they would also be the religious leaders of the community, and that these 12 imams all have some connection to the line of Ali and Hussein, who was the grandson who was killed, and that they have a sort of prophetic power. And the fact that the Shia began, and particularly in Iran, began to adopt some of their own ritual practices. So the fact that the Shahada is slightly different, the fact that you can pray 3 and not 5 times a day, the fact that there's a different way of standing when you pray, and understanding the role of the Ayatollahs in sort of the Shia tradition, which doesn't exist in the Sunni tradition, really began to sort of cause some rifts, and then that gets multiplied then by some political and national rifts that really begin to separate them. So much so that there are some in the Sunni tradition who consider Shia, heretics and vice versa, and it has. A lot of it has its roots in a kind of nationalism, a kind of way of thinking about who should be the next leader and how to understand.
Let me jump in here because we're running out of time. Simplify this. Muhammad, remember as I told you, Muhammad was born an orphan, was raised by his uncle. His uncle has a son by the name of Ali. Muhammad virtually raises Ali as his son and marries Ali to his daughter Fatima. And hence, for tribal society, the bloodline that flows out of Ali through Ali and Fatima is the closest to a direct bloodline with Muhammad. Ali will claim that Muhammad told him that he was to take over the reins of the kingdom of the Ummah community when he died. But he was a relatively young man, and the elders in Medina chose Abu Bakr as the leader, and then they chose Omar, then they chose Umar, but finally they chose Ali. But as soon as Ali was chosen, Uthman's nephew, who was the military governor of Damascus, claimed that this was not correct, that Uthman, his uncle, had promised to him that he would take over. Ali and Uthman meet on the field of battle. It's inconclusive. They have a mediator. And then eventually, a different group, the Kharijites, come in and try to assassinate both. But they only kill Ali. So Muawiyah takes over as the last man standing. That's sort of the origins of it. With grandson of Muhammad, Hassan and Hussein, the two children of Ali and Fatima, will then try to make claims to take over after Muawiyah, but he hands it to his son. And that's when, in effect, Hussein is slaughtered. You go to Iran today, there are ceremonies where people walk through the streets beating themselves with whips, right, in memory of Hussein and his assassination. More questions? I think that's certainly fundamental, yeah.
Can you briefly
We don't have much time, so it can be brief.
description of what distinguishes the Sufi tradition?
Sufism is incorrectly sometimes referred to as the mystical tradition of Islam. And there are many in the Islamic community who would consider Sufis to be not Muslim. But the Sufi tradition is really just taking most of the teachings, most of the writings. They are Muslim. They believe in the 5 pillars. They're mostly Sunni, although there's some Shia. They follow many of the same traditions and understanding, but they have a more internal understanding of what it is their life is, an experience of their faith. And so for the Sufi tradition, the notion that you would go through stages of sort of prayer and reflection and understanding, and then eventually you come to sort of an intimacy with God that some people consider to be blasphemous, some Muslims consider to be blasphemous. We do this usually with a teacher of some kind, and oftentimes they've developed many there's schools of Sufism in different parts of the world that have many of the same sort of ways of understanding deep prayer, deep meditation, a reflection upon the self, and eventually an erasing of the self, and then this kind of communion with Allah. And that's what sometimes gets misunderstood. To be a Sufi means to be a Muslim. And one of the things that's happened is that Sufism, like Buddhism, has been co-opted sometimes by people who don't want to claim the faith and to pick up pieces and other touches of it.
Let me throw in one thing because we have to leave right now.
Okay, sorry.
They are extremely tolerant of other forms of revelation and have made, if you will, the missionary class of Islam because they are willing to accept revelation in many forms that occurs, which indeed is in the Quran. But the Sufis have been the ones who have been most open to talking to other people about the nature of revelation in their own tradition. Okay, I think we got to call it break right now. Thank you very much.
Picture is 4,000 words. So I'm going to take you through a bunch of pictures of architectural examples of Muslim architecture and take you through the history a little bit, going back. So starting from about 658 when the first mosque was built. Now this one is not a mosque. This is the in Jerusalem, Dome of the Rock, and it's actually a sacred place. You see the rock inside. So obviously, what they've done here, they sort of situated this as a central plan with these columns around and people being able to move around this thing freely on the outside. In terms of where the idea of this came from, obviously you had to build on something. And so they actually used ideas from Byzantine architecture, which you probably heard about, and Sassanids, which you probably never heard of. But the ideas that you see here obviously have been were available in terms of construction. And that is the dome itself. The dome is actually a double dome. It has 2 layers. On the outside, it's all gold. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. You see the light being brought through those windows at the top. And then you see the colonnade. Now notice the arches. You know, they're 4 half-round arches. Eventually, the shape of the arch is going to change into more of a horseshoe arch, which is something that when you look at a building today and you see this kind of a horseshoe arch, you could almost be certain it's something to do with Muslim architecture. But the decorations and all the colors on the inside are from the Byzantine period. And they actually literally employed some Byzantine masons and artisans to actually create the tile work on the outside. Notice there is no other decoration there. Obviously it stands out. Anywhere you look at Jerusalem, you always see the Dome of the Rock. And here it is, another picture of it. It's right very close to the Wailing Road wall. There is actually, you see this walk, you know, and unfortunately that's the way it is. You know, you have to separate people, which is too bad. I wish they would all be able to enjoy the sites without having to go through this structure. But that's the way you have to go to the Dome of the Rock. And here's another shot of it without that structure. All right, here is a model of it. The cutaway view, again, you see the columns around, it's a central plan. And the golden dome, and here you can sort of see, if you look at the very top of that dome, how it was actually constructed. The building itself has been renovated many times. Again, notice on the outside, there's really no pictures, as you know, there's no saints. Mostly it's all what we call arabesque, which is geometric forms. They just repeat, you know, as you can see, some variation here and there. At the very, very top there, you can see those are actually passages from Quran. And obviously, that's the very, very top. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the decorations of that. And again, the unique part about Dome of the Rock, which is the most famous of all the Muslim buildings, is really not a mosque, right? It's just a temple to go and visit, and you can actually go inside. I want to see the inside of it. And you can actually go into the rock. Down below there is an opening, and I'll show you that in a second. Here are some more pictures of that. Here is the rock, and here is the inside of it. And here is the view of it. You know, as you can see, there's an opening there, which brings light, natural light into the inside, and there is a little cavern there below it. So that's Dome of the Rock. Now, in terms of the actual mosques. So, actually, no, chronologically. So this one is one of the largest ones. This is after, as you can see, this is Samarra, what's today Iraq. Samarra became a center, it was actually a capital. It was when it was moved from Baghdad. So at around 850, this is when this was built. As you can see, it's a large open space with hyper-style hall, what we call. You see all these columns there? The problem is, you know, when some of my architecture students who actually are here, they know what the problem is. You cannot go too far between the columns, right? So if you like to have a large area with a roof over, you have to build all these columns. The problem with that is, you know, if I were here in this space, you know, with all these columns, you could probably see me very well. So what they did is they left a large open space inside, and that would be also used for prayers. But because of the hot sun, you have to provide some protection, and so they actually did that by having literally flat roof over these columns all the way around. You probably know that they have to be, each one of these mosques has to be oriented correctly towards Mecca for praying. And then notice down at the bottom there, number 5 is a minaret. This is a very unusual minaret. It's the only one in the world that actually has this kind of a shape and form. We have not seen anything like that anywhere else. And the Qibla War, which is down there at the top, number 2, actually it's a little bit more to the left because the, Sod, which is the open courtyard, and then the Qibla War with the Mihrab niche, right, which is right at the top there. And that's facing Mecca.
Can you tell us what that is then, so we understand? When you say the Qibla War and the...
Okay, so the niche, which I'll show you pictures of more of these niches.
Yeah.
This is basically where you orient yourself to
Because
pray.
no one has done that yet, so...
Oh, okay, all right, so you will see more pictures of that. Again, all of this is pointing towards Mecca, and basically this is the way you pray. That's the direction everybody's facing. So if you imagine people facing this, being in that open courtyard, everybody would be going actually this way here, right? Because that's the minaret there on the other side. Now what you see here is actually that has been rebuilt. If you notice the walls, they have different colors. So there are parts of the old walls and there are parts of the new walls. So they actually did a pretty good job rebuilding it. This is a picture back from the 20s where you can actually see this is the way it looked like before they did some restoration. Which, we always wonder about, is that something good or bad? Would this be more appropriate to actually show people the way this was, or the way that it is today, which is rebuilt? But that's a different subject, of course. Here is that minaret. And the interesting thing is you can actually walk all the way up to the top. Most minarets are actually used to call for prayer. You will see sometimes 4, sometimes 7, different numbers. Here you only have 1. Again, this was one of the early mosques. And again, very unusual. Notice the lack of railings, right? Makes for a very interesting climb. I was lucky enough to actually go there and actually see it myself. The view from the top is amazing. And unfortunately, in this photo, if you look closely, you'll see something disturbing at the top. You see that? It's an outpost with a machine gun. Unfortunately, it's from the war. You can also see that this has been all cordoned off. Now it's open again, so much nicer. But that's the way it looks from the close-up. Again, notice the different coloration of the brick. A lot of the bricks in this area were mud dry, sun-dry mud bricks. Later on, they moved into brick, fire brick, which is much stronger. But the area is actually prone to flooding, and this is why you saw these missing parts of the walls where they actually flooded. So that's the Great Mosque of Samarra. Now I'm going to take you through a little bit later times. And here you see what these mosques would very often look like today. And I'm going to take you through Tunisia, in Cordoba, Spain, and back in Iraq and India. There's a lot of examples of that. Here you can see, notice the arch. The arch becomes a little bit more half-rounded, like again that horseshoe kind of an arch. Columns, actually. Again, as I started in the beginning, they started out by taking some of the elements of the architectural components that they've seen in the area, like, again, was today Iraq, or Saudi Arabia, or Spain, further, Africa, and then India. And they would use those elements and eventually change them to their own liking. But this is the part that you see behind. That's that flat roof area with the hypo-style hole behind. And that's where the mihrab would be, and also the minbar, which I will show you in a second, which is kind of the podium. Notice here down below, this is a fountain very often in many of these cleanliness is very important. So for people who come in and didn't do a proper cleaning, they could actually use one of those fountains out in the open courtyard. And again, the whole area is walled off, has this peristyle, which are basically colonnades on the perimeter, so people can move and shade around, and then the large open space, inside. Now, this is under that protected roof. You'll see the carpets on the floors. You even see carpets wrapped around the columns to protect that. Obviously, everybody takes shoes off. I'm sure you've seen that. I don't have to talk about that. And so they all come in here and they basically pray right in this area. And one more time, notice the columns, the braces you see here, they've been added later for some stability. Columns, some of them very often used literally from other buildings. And so you would see one particular style and then you would see another one and so on. Eventually, for mosques that were built totally from scratch, they would have a different shape and form, slightly. But the ideas will be all the same. So again, an open courtyard, some kind of a minaret to call for prayers, and then fountain for washing, and and then colonnade around it so you can actually move around. And one more time, notice the shape of the arch. And so there are some more examples. Notice the walls, again, the way they're decorated. In some cases, you would see carvings on the walls or tile. This is tile. This is very, if you look at the back wall there, it's very, very similar to some of the decorations that you see in some of the Byzantine churches. Remember, the churches had a little bit of a head start, right? So this is at about 650 on to about, so what I'm showing you is actually some of it is actually already 12th century and later, but you would see the same kind of an idea because that's sort of something that they used over and over again. So this is now the inside of some of these mosques, and here you'll see that raised podium, minbar. And there, right there to the left there, on the left side, this is your mihrab. And these very often were decorated in a very fancy way. This one, as you can see, has decorations very often in that niche itself. They actually developed a very interesting technique where they would hang stones from the niche itself. And the idea is that if you actually grab something, this is grab something and you squeeze it, it can actually hang. But for most people, it was an amazing sight because you actually see these things like stone dripping from the ceiling, which was an amazing sight. And of course, that whole back wall, that's the Wiba wall, that's the wall for prayers. And the raised platform again for imam to come in and conduct the ceremony.
So we understand, that wall is facing Mecca?
Right.
Okay, so when people pray towards that wall, they're facing
They're
Mecca.
facing the Mecca.
The mihrab then is what?
Hmm?
The mihrab, that space like that?
That's the actual niche.
Yeah.
That's like a center point. So that would be very often right in the center of that back wall. So you would be able to
That's
like.
the point of orientation.
That's the point of orientation. So for people that are a little bit off to the right or to the left, everybody be facing. Very often you see people lining up in one way, but in some mosques you actually see them turning a little bit because if you really want to be very, very precise, so that God would hear you, you would point that back up. Here are some other examples of that minbar, where you can see the steps leading up, and the imam would be there at the top, talking to the congregation. They very often have sort of like a sermon, right, where they would talk about religious issues and so on, and more about that. I'm sure other speakers will talk about that. But I'm here mostly to talk about architecture. And again, architecturally speaking, the influences are mostly Byzantine, and then from some of the area. Notice how the columns are, very, very often a little bit different. I'll show you some examples of mosques and architectural examples from India, and you will see that they look very similar. Because one of the important things to understand is when you go to places like Jerusalem, on one street, you would have 3 different religions, literally, as in there would be a church, there would be a mosque, and there would be a synagogue. And for anybody traveling back in those days, probably wanted to make sure that you're going to the right place, right? Not by accident, but most people would know, of course. But you would see, and even today, when you look at a building, you can identify that this is a church. And you can look at a building from the outside, and you can see that this is a mosque. And you can look at a synagogue. They have a little bit more complicated history, and they have very clear identities, but it would be a similar idea of having these components that would be the same. So, a church in Middle middle of Africa and a mosque in the middle of Africa would look pretty much the same. Right? So the idea was that all these components are there. You sort of take them, you sometimes modify them, you change them, as you can see on some of the minarets and some of the walls on the outside, slightly different. Because, you know, after all, you have to use the local force, as in local people, to build this. But here are some other examples of minarets. Yeah, I have 2 minutes. Okay, go ahead. Look at this. This is actually carved out of one slab of marble. Right? Light comes right through. Here is another one of those mirrors. Look at the top there. Okay, now this is speedy. Right. So here are the open. This is actually in Cairo. Now it's part of the university. And here is more examples of these niches. And the look at the text here. This is all text from the Quran, right? And look at some of these examples. And this is Dome of the Rock before it was actually renovated. And 1 minute for India. I don't want to miss that. Right here, and you will see various similarities. Now these arches here, they're called multi-fold arches, and you can almost see how they get very, very fancy. But you see the decorations on it, very similar. This is pretty nice. This is a spa. And notice the minarets here, right? They had a little bit different shape and form, but it's still the same idea. Some of it, okay, well, this is a mosque from the outside, right? Main entry, colonnade, buildings behind, which is the sort of inside, and then the open space behind it on the other side.
This is logo.
Right, right. Okay? Am I over with time? I think I'm good. I don't know if you have any questions, you know, because I obviously, this was like a condensed, you know, version. At the end, okay. Okay.
In Islam's 5 pillars of faith, the first, which is the Shahada, which is there is no God except God, Allah. That has considerable philosophical implications. First, reality is one. No challenge to that one. It's one. Second, by reality is one, truth is one. We saw that Professor Brzezinski was saying that the mosque had no statues, pictures, etc. Because if we try to go and picture Allah, the one, we'd always do it in a particular way, in a multifaceted way, and that would be equivalent to idolatry. So, no pictures of Allah. You think about, your picture of God is going to be a particular one, whether it is in the image of Abraham or Jesus or whoever. You have a particular focus, but that kind of limits and does not open up to the transcendent, the universal, the oneness of Allah. As Mohammed noted, we are all born with innate knowledge that reality is one and truth is one. But it gets lost under societal conventions. But how does it get lost? How is it that the society originally lost this kind of knowledge? How does it get covered over? The Quran has a story about Allah's creation and favor for human race. Angels, led by Satan, are upset. Allah favors the human race, and Satan, being the representative, questions Allah, and then when Allah says they are just, my favorites, asks for permission to test humankind to see if they would remain faithful to Allah despite the temptations of the world. Allah allows this. This is a major difference. It's not that Satan is working as an independent God, because after all, God or Allah is one. You can't have two gods. But Allah permits Satan to try to tempt the human race to see if they will go and adhere to Allah and the oneness of His truth, or be tempted away by distractions of the world. And that's what happens. We get distracted by the world and we lose this innate knowledge. So the belief goes. This harkens back this idea of trying to lose and remember knowledge, harkens back to Plato's theory of recollection, which is, very quickly, is the idea that somehow we, due to being in a bodily form, get kind of stuffed with matter and forget the goodness and the truth that is one and real. And the rest of our lives is an attempt to recover what we already know, this innate idea. So we see that philosophy and Islam's religion coincide on this point. Another way to read the Shahada is that there is nothing apart from Allah. I think Professor Edge is going to be talking a bit about Sufism, and this harkens towards that. Here, the thinker, Farabi, enters. If there is nothing but Allah, what of the multitude of the material world? Borrowing from Greek Neoplatonism, Farabi, says that all else is an emanation from Allah. He being the necessary cause from which all else is there. From the greater, emanating from the greater to the lesser emanations. Those are contingent effects that depend on the one necessary effect, which is Allah. So kind of look at it this way. The bacteria in your stomach is kind of real, but it is part of you. You are part of the ecosystem of the world. The solar system is now going to have emanated the Earth. The Milky Way, the solar system. The universe, the Milky Way. A hierarchical of spiritual entities up a ladder, all the way to the top, Allah, but nothing causes Allah. Allah is the necessary cause of all other things that emanate from Him. Thus, everything is, in one form or another, a manifestation and manifesting the reality of Allah. Thus, idolatry is the mistaking some manifestation of Allah as if it was a God in itself. This includes, but not limited to, say, animistic claims that trees, rocks, rivers are somehow spiritual and divine. Those religions such as we find in ancient Greek and Rome, which are polytheistic, believing in multiple gods. But a little bit closer to home, the capitalist, the materialist belief that happiness and reality is material, and that one could go and find one's fulfillment in kind of stuffing yourself with Coca-Cola or good food and sex on the side. In short, if we go and idolize capitalist goals, that too is idolatry, if Allah is one and the truth is one. That, though no way condones, but explains why the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the intent to go and hit one of the Capitol buildings happened. You see, we would be the great Satan. You see, Satan is the tempter to go and tempt people away from Allah to idolatry. And though I cannot condone any of the actions subsequent to that belief, the argument could be made that, in fact, they were doing a service, because when you go and commit a sin against Allah, you prolong your time in hell. But not forever. So stop the people from harming themselves so that they can turn back to the one truth, the one reality. Bad motive, but it fits in with the theology. But that's not the heart of Islam, to be absolutely clear. Note that Sufi Islam tries to capture the idea that we are manifestations of God and manifesting Allah. Sufism has a saying, sometimes I am God, sometimes God is me. Note this also points to Aristotle's Godhead. Aristotle had this view moving from potential to actuality. But what motivates that movement from potential to actuality? Why does an egg become a chicken? Why does a seed become a tree? Why do you become from the womb of your mother to being an adult? It isn't that you're pushed from behind, it's more like you're drawn towards the perfection of the Godhead, Aristotle would say. So that you're pulled, in effect, almost like a magnet pulls metal, towards your fulfillment, your actuality. The Godhead is the perfect perfection, only contemplating itself, though, with Aristotle. So we see that we can't go and fully map Aristotle onto the Islamic belief that Allah is one, because Allah is concerned. Whereas Aristotle's God knows nothing. He studies his own navel. He only sees his own perfection. But others are pulled to their perfection, come back to that perfection after emanating from it. And this is where we can go and see how we can go and bring these two together. The idea that the perfect perfection from which all emanates from also draws it back to itself, thereby pulling all to express their particular manifestation of perfection. And that would be the unique way that we can go and actually demonstrate the oneness and the truth of Allah in our own lives, if we are faithful enough and submit to that reality. So now, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, pulls it all together. He says, well, hold on, there seems to be sometimes a conflict between faith and science, and faith and religion, but he says, no, if truth is one, these are two sides of the same coin. Right? Two sides are different, but they are the same coin. Truth is one, though shown in different realms in different ways. Preserving the oneness of Allah, despite apparent methods and ways of understanding the divine reality, is the goal of understanding the oneness of Allah. It is a way of approaching the theology through a philosophy, borrowing from various sources, bringing it together into one cohesive whole. This is only an aspect of the philosophy, the philosophies that we can go and find in connecting the philosophy to Islam, but it is, I believe, a central trend, a central thread. So, thank you.
Come, whoever you are, non-believer, fire worshiper, come. Ours is not a covenant of despair. Even if you have broken your vows 100 times, come, yet again, come. Love is the perfect stillness, the greatest excitement, and the most profound act. And the word comes almost as complete as his name. Playfully, you hid from me. All day I looked. Then I discovered I was you. And the celebration of that began. In these three short poems, we see, respectively, Rumi, Rabia, and Lala, the basic tenets of love that are at the heart of Sufism. Acceptance of all, because all is love, because God is all. Thank you, Patrick. Sufism is considered a mystic branch of Islam because a mystic is a person seeking an inner spiritual experience of being one with the divine, with God, with Allah, with all that is, with the universe. In other religions, and as in other religions, these mystics raise concerns with the traditional ranks and often face opposition and condemnation. So we are grateful that the Sufis were able to find and establish a place for themselves within Islam, because the outpouring of these beautiful expressions of love for and by God have found an audience throughout the world in the form of their chanting, their dancing, and this beautiful ecstatic poetry. Indeed, I doubt that there is a yoga studio anywhere in the U.S. that does not have at least one poem by Rumi hanging on its walls, although yoga is a Hindu practice and not an Islamic one. In fact, I came to know Rumi and Sufism through Kripalu, a yoga center in the Massachusetts, when I happened upon a performance of spoken word poetry of Rumi by Shah Ram Shiva. I was taken aback. My heart was broken open by this beautiful language of love, and I became a student of this message of the love at the core of Sufism. And I'm grateful to Dr. Howard for having asked me to come here today and share some of the history, the beliefs, and the ecstatic expressions of Sufism. So the word Sufi, S-U-F-I, comes from the word sul, meaning wool. There are several theories about the origins of the name, but the most common is that the earliest Sufis wore woolen clothes as a sign of poverty and simplicity. And we can see the reasons for this in the origins of Sufism itself. So about 200 years after the death of Muhammad, some Muslims became concerned with the turn that Islam had taken as it prospered towards worldly and material matters. They felt as if Islam had become a gilded shell with concern only for its external life, leaving a more hollow interior. They felt that the way to truly fulfill the divine law was to live it fully by seeking God from within. The beautiful silk and satin clothing worn by the more wealthy Muslims was a symbol of this exterior concern. So these newer Muslims, well, not newer, but ones that are thinking this way, took to wearing the rough woolen clothes as an outward sign that they were focusing on their internal spiritual life as opposed to the external one. Hence the name Sufi. That said, the Sufis did not and still do not live cloistered lives. They have regular occupations, they get married, they participate in community life. They simply gather together in groups called orders to dance, pray, sing, and listen to teachings of the Quran by spiritual teachers called sheikhs. Today, there are many Sufi orders all over the world, including here in the U.S. Excuse me, I just forgot that I'm allergic to this room and I'm having an allergic reaction. One of the most basic beliefs of Sufism is that everything is God, as Dr. Kabir is saying. And this is one of the beliefs that led to controversy within traditional Islam, because how could a chair or a rock be God, much less you or me? The fear was that theirs was a pantheistic belief rather than the monotheistic belief at the heart of Islam. But the Sufi belief came from Muhammad himself when he said the only God is God. Their belief is that God, the Creator, wanted to be known. And in order to be known, there had to be something outside of himself to look back to see him. But given that there is nothing outside of God, the only way that he could accomplish this was to create expressions of himself that would then move far enough away to be able to look back and see him. That means everything is an expression of God. If something was not an expression of God, then it would have to be an expression of something else. And that would be to deny that the only God is God. And that would be against the Quran. An apt analogy might be, what is the difference between an apple and the tree from which it falls? When questioned about his faith, Rumi, who was a great spiritual teacher and poet, answered, I am the slave of the Quran while I still have life. I am the dust on the path of Muhammad, the chosen one. If anyone interprets my words in any other way, I deplore that person and I deplore his words. This belief that God is, everything is God, is why the Sufis welcome everyone, no matter their faith or caste, because because to not do so would be to not accept an expression of God. So in order to please God, the Sufis believe we are supposed to seek to know Him while we are alive. And in order to know Him, we must look only within ourselves, because that is the most direct connection that we have back to our source, back to God. The Sufis believe that though any good Muslim, following the divine law, will indeed be reunited with God upon their death, they are seeking to be as close to God as possible while still alive. And any of these close brushes that we may have with Him will produce a sense of ecstasy unrivaled by anything in the external and material world. The point being, we are already one with God, but we are having an experience of separation, like the apple that has fallen from the tree. When a person awakens from within to this knowledge, a fire is ignited in their heart that creates a longing for the whole self, our one true love, God. We have an unquenchable thirst to be with Him, and this is why ecstatic Sufis will call themselves lovers and call God the beloved. Mirallah, a great Sufi poet. Love, you have wrecked my body. Keep doing that. I am more well with this deep ache of missing you than content with the physical wonders you can pacify us with. Mirabai used to run around naked saying things like that. She didn't need clothes, she had God. In order to reach God, methods were established within the various Sufi orders that would facilitate these moments of drawing close to Him, these moments of ecstasy. During these ecstatic states, which could last for days for some Sufis, the lover becomes dissociated from themselves and completely engrossed in the grace and love of God. Sufis who achieve these states are often said to be drunk with love. The goal is to develop this love of the heart and to see the world through these eyes of the heart. Three of the most well-known methods of achieving these ecstatic states are zikrs, which is group chanting of God's name and movement, whirling, which is dancing, and then finally the recitation of poetry. Different Sufi orders practice zikr, Z-I-K-R, one way to spell it, in different ways. The basics are that the name of God is chanted, often with an accent on the first syllable, which is the out-breath, while the group moves rhythmically to the chant. As Kabir, another Sufi mystic and poet, said, "The breath that does not repeat the name of God is a wasted breath." The point is to remove anything from one's mind except the name of God, so that we are awakened to His presence within and our own divine nature. So it may sound like this: ha, la, ha, la, ha. The pace will speed up and slow down, while progressively going faster and faster. I had the very good fortune of participating in a large zikr with a Sufi order that gathered at the base of the Washington Monument in D.C. at sunset. It was glorious, right? With our arms linked, circles formed one inside the other, concentric circles, moving in opposite directions. With each out-breath, we thrust our heads down, exaggerated, right, this force of the out-breath and the sound. It made me feel lightheaded rather quickly. So it was ha, 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 over and over. But as we continued, this lightheadedness gave way to this euphoria that seemed to carry us along by its own energy. An energy that was outside any one of the participants, yet coming from within us at the very same time. This feeling lingered with me for days. It was amazing. Another method to reach this ecstatic state is to spin or to whirl. Rumi, the great spiritual teacher and poet, developed this method in his order called the Mevlevi order, whose members became world famous as the whirling dervishes. A dervish is a member of the Mevlevi order. In whirling, the dervishes spin around their center and repeat the name of God, Allah, with each turn. Their focus then turns inward, and all thoughts of themselves and of the world are released as they turn, and they can turn very fast. So whirling began when Rumi's great spiritual teacher, Shams of Tabriz, went missing. It is said that when Rumi met Shams, that they had an instant, deep spiritual relationship, such that Rumi's notion of God went even further higher. But Rumi's disciples were upset because they felt that Rumi only loved Shams and not them, and they chased Shams away. Rumi was devastated by that. One day, when Rumi was in the market, he thought he heard Shams calling his name, and he put his hand to his ear. He said, "Shams, where are you?" And he reached out his hand to reach for Shams, but he couldn't see him, and he thought he heard his name being turned another way, so he turned. And as he turned, listening for his name, he started to turn in circles. Thus began the whirling in an effort to reach the God within our beloved. I also learned how to do that in this great poem. But the point of whirling is not just to get high on God, but to bring what we learn from these ecstatic experiences back into our daily lives, to keep our hearts, right, and to keep our hearts open, and to spread more love to the external world. It's all about the love. So the third method of achieving an ecstatic state is actually, right, how we accomplish this, which is the recitation of poetry. Many Sufi masters would spontaneously recite poetry as it came to them during their ecstatic states, and others would record it because of the valuable lessons they contain, as well as their beauty. So in this final poem, we can see the use of poetic elements, such as the anthropomorphism of love, and the symbolism that is so important to the understanding of Sufi poetry. So in this poem, you're going to hear moon. A moon is somebody who is so enlightened by God that their face reflects God when you look at it. And to be silent is to have emptied our mind of so much of ourselves that all we hear is the voice of God. This is a translation of the poem Love Said to Me by Shahram Shiva, and I have to say, this is the poem that did me in. Right? This is the one that snagged me. Careful with my nose and stuff. I worship the moon. Tell me of the soft glow of a candlelight and the sweetness of my moon. Don't talk about sorrow. Tell me of that treasure, hidden if it is to you. Then just remain silent. Last night, I lost my grip on reality and welcomed insanity. Love saw me and said, I showed up. Wipe your tears and be silent. I said, oh, love, I am frightened, but it is not you. Love said to me, there is nothing that is not me. Be silent. I will whisper secrets in your ear. Just nod yes and be silent. A soul moon appeared in the path of my heart. How precious is this journey? I said, oh love, what kind of moon is this? Love said to me, this is not for you to question. Be silent. I said, oh love, what kind of face is this? Angelic or human? Love said to me, this is beyond anything that you know. Be silent. I said, please reveal this to me. I am dying in anticipation. Love said to me, that is where I want you. Always on the edge. Be silent. You dwell in this house of images and illusions. Leave this house now and be silent. I said, oh love, tell me this. Does the Lord know you are treating me this way? Love said to me, yes, he does. Yes, he does. Now just be totally silent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Morris. We're program, and I know how strongly Dr. Howard feels about the importance at an event like this to have some time for student questions and answers and discussion. So I'm going to truncate my remarks a little bit. I did leave copies of a handout that summarized the chronology of the events that I'm going to talk about and some related ones. And if there aren't enough copies in the back of the room, I can make plenty more. But I'd like to take a minute of my time right at the beginning to offer a few words of praise, even tribute, to Dr. Robert Howard, who has founded this event 11 years ago. He's been a presenter at the History Symposium, I believe, every year in its existence. He gave a wonderful presentation in the earlier session, and it was awesome, especially because not only did he organize this event, but he's teaching a very, very heavy load this term. He's also co-chair of one of the most important committees on the campus. That's just a remarkable demonstration of engagement and commitment to excellence. So would you please stand up for just a moment and look at Dr. Robert Howard and give him a hand. I'm in awe of the expertise that the other faculty presenters have demonstrated this morning, and I can't come close to that. Some of you may know that I'm primarily a historian of the American Civil War. I don't claim to know very much about Islam or the Muslim world, and there's simply no way, even with the time that I had, to prepare to get to that level of expertise. So I'm not going to claim to be something that I'm not. What I'm going to do instead for 7 or 10 minutes is to offer some reflections on a wonderful book that I highly recommend. It's by Sylvia Diop. It's titled Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas. This is one of the most interesting books that I've read in a long time. I ended up acquiring an extra copy during the course of my preparations. I'm going to donate it to the NCC library, and it will become part of the collection as soon as it's been processed. I can't recommend the book highly enough. And I'm not going to be able to do complete justice to Dr. Diop, but I do want to tell you a little bit about her and then about this book, and then offer a couple of reactions to it. Dr. Sylvia Diop, who has a Senegalese father and a French mother, received her PhD from the University of Paris, and she is now the director of the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. That's a Harlem-based branch of the New York Public Library System, and it's one of the leading research facilities in the world dedicated to the history of the African diaspora, the dispersion of African peoples. The history of slavery in the Americas covers a period of nearly 400 years. The first African slaves were brought to the Americas in 1501, and it wasn't until 1888 that Brazil became the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. During that period of nearly 400 years, according to Dr. Diop, between 12 and 13 million Africans were taken into the custody of people, never legally. They were forced into slavery, transported to, and then sold in markets in the New World, in North and South America, Central America, of course, as well, and the Caribbean. Of that total, she estimates that between 2 and 3 million were Muslims. As a result, beginning in the early 16th century, there has been a powerful and important Muslim presence in the New World. The Americas became a significant outpost of the Muslim world. And I make this point, at least in part, because Dr. Greeley, during her presentation about an hour ago, spoke about the expansion of Islam until it became a worldwide religion. That wasn't always voluntary. I say every one of the original Muslims who came to the Americas came as a prisoner, often a prisoner of war. They were in this part of the world completely involuntarily, but they brought with them their religion, their culture, and they maintained it even under the harsh pressure to convert to Christianity, which was imposed upon practically all of them. What is most remarkable about this book, therefore, as one academic reviewer noted, is that Dr. Diab's main thesis is that the experience of enslavement of African Muslims in the Americas deepened rather than destroyed the religious fervor of these believers. It's a remarkable story, and as I said a few minutes ago, I can't recommend it highly enough. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to focus on only two facets of this book because there simply isn't time available to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of Muslim slaves in the history of slave revolts and rebellions in what became the United States in the 19th century. And then also I'm going to talk about the reaction of Muslim slaves to a policy called colonization, the plan of white men that originated in 1816 to deport freed slaves from the United States and to send them back to Africa or to other places in the Caribbean and in Latin America. The first slave revolt in the Americas took place in 1522. In other words, within 20 years of the arrival of the first African slaves in the Americas, they began revolting. My guess is that those revolts began 10 minutes after they got here, but the first recorded slave revolt was in 1522. In about 1620, in North America, the first slaves began arriving in what was first English, then British North America, and finally the United States. And there was a constant threat of slave revolts from all slaves, with reasons I'll explain in a couple of minutes, perhaps especially from Muslims, first to England and then to the United States. It should be noted, of course, as all of the presenters have, that Islam is has a very diverse community of believers. It's very difficult to generalize, and it's especially difficult to generalize about Muslim slaves, slaves of any religion in the New World, because this slave population in the Americas was spread from the northernmost of the original 13 North American colonies to southern Brazil. That's a distance of 5,000 miles. This slave population was not monolithic. Each slave was an independent actor. Some were willing to fight for their freedom. It appears that Muslim slaves were particularly prominent in leading resistance to the institution of slavery throughout the Americas. They have been described in some of the historical literature as members of a moral minority who resisted slavery when they could and escaped bondage when circumstances permitted that. Before I get to those couple of points, I want to emphasize the breadth of Dr. Diab's study. It's a very important book that speaks knowledgeably about many aspects of Muslim life in the Americas under slavery, including the maintenance of their clothing, their music, their cuisine, and many other aspects of their lives. I suggested a minute ago, she also writes very knowledgeably about attempts to force Muslims to convert to Christianity. Her point about that, and it's a very important point, is that often those conversions were only of a pseudo nature. In other words, some Muslims agreed or consented to accept Christianity, but they continued to practice their Muslim beliefs. They were being forced, or attempts were being made to force them to adopt an alien religion. Slaves of all religions were required to change their names. They were often pressured to abandon their language and other customs. I regret that I just don't have time to talk about those points because they are fascinating, but again, this book will be available in the NCC library, I would guess, within a few weeks. So let me talk first in the main body of my paper about Muslims resisting slavery through rebellion. According to Dr. Diop, Muslim slaves played important roles in the Haitian Revolution that took place between 1791 and 1804, and also in a great slave revolt in a place called Bahia in Brazil in 1835. But, like much of history, that is contested. Dr. Diop believes that one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, a man who is universally recognized by historians by the name of Bookman, was originally from Jamaica and might have been a Muslim. She deduces that from his name. Most historians, when they even speak to this point, believe that Boukman got his name, the way it's spelled in the French sources is Boukman, but the historians from the English tradition believe that his name probably was originally Boukman, Bookman, and that could have been a name that a slave could have been given in one of the English-speaking colonies in the late 18th century. Dr. Diop has a different view. She believes that Boukman might, in fact, have been known as a man of the book, which was a phrase that was often used apparently in West African Muslim societies to refer to men who were knowledgeable about the Quran and other Islamic sources. That can't be proved. And as a matter of fact, I brought along with me another book, which I'm using as a supplementary text in United States History 1 online this term. This is by Matthew J. Cleveland. It's titled Toussaint Louverture and the American Civil War, the Promise and Peril of a Second Haitian Revolution. Professor Cleveland, who's a fine young historian, trained at American University in Washington, and now teaching at the University of Houston in Texas, refers to Boukman, doesn't say anything about the possibility that he had Muslim ancestry. Doesn't mean that one or the other is incorrect, but it does suggest to me that there probably is an undertold, perhaps unknown history of Islam in the Americas, and we're only beginning to appreciate that. We do know, or at least we believe we know, that there was an important Muslim presence in the planning for the Great Bahia Rebellion in Brazil in 1835, but even that is contested these days. Apparently a Brazilian scholar recently went back to the historical record and has challenged that interpretation. As the saying goes, history is a complicated thing. The real question for me is whether these examples of possible Muslim leadership in slave rebellions elsewhere in the Caribbean and South America suggest that the pattern might have held in the United States. Once again, the historical record is uncertain. It's possible that Muslim slaves or their descendants played underappreciated roles in the slave revolts in the 19th century. And one of the reasons why Dr. Diop suggests that this is possible, if not likely, is that many of the Muslims who were brought to the Americas in the slave trade were literate in Arabic. They were natural leaders because of their communication skills that allowed them to resist slavery and to escape from it when they could. African Muslims in the Americas, especially in the first and second generations, had a passion for liberty, but that probably could be said of slaves of any religious tradition, but they certainly appear to have been more successful in maintaining, in many ways, their belief in their religion and in transmitting that invaluable facet of their culture to their children and grandchildren. Muslims, almost certainly, at least in Dr. Diop's view, were highly sophisticated and literate in Arabic. That does challenge existing racial norms, but it made them natural leaders in planning and sometimes executing slave rebellions. During the 250 years of slavery in what became the United States, that's the period from about 1620 when the first slaves were imported into North America until 1865 when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, there were numerous small slave rebellions and four major ones. One at Stono River in South Carolina colony in 1739, Gabriel Prosser's revolt in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey's in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, and Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton County in southeastern Virginia in 1831. To these, one might add the famous rebellion that took place on the slave ship La Amistad in 1839. There is no direct evidence of Muslim slaves' involvement in most of them, but that may say more about the inability of historians to unearth that history than anything else. What we do know, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting facts in Dr. Diaz's book, is that in the possessions of one of the slaves implicated in Vesey's planned revolt in Charleston in 1822 was a fragment of writing in Arabic, almost certainly produced and then maintained by a Muslim. That is intriguing. This is an interesting footnote, I believe. In 1818, Harriet Bailey, a slave in Talbot County, Maryland, gave birth to a son whom she named Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. When Frederick was 18, he escaped slavery, discarded the name Bailey, adopted the name Douglas, and went on to become the greatest of the abolitionists and a pioneering civil rights leader after the Civil War. All of that is well known. This is what I think is curious. According to historian William McFeely, who's the author of the authoritative biography of Frederick Douglass, Douglass might have taken, or his mother might have taken the name Bailey from a husband or an ancestor, and that may be the entire story. But there is another possibility, and that is that the English surname Bailey, B-A-I-L-E-Y, might be an anglicized version of the West African name Bilali, B-I-L-A-L-I, which was a name that apparently was quite common among Muslim slaves in the Atlantic slave trade. It's possible, therefore, that the great Frederick Douglass was descended from Muslim slaves. We do know that one of Douglass's closest collaborators, Martin Robeson Delaney, founder with Douglass of an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star, later a medical doctor who was briefly trained at Harvard and eventually became the highest ranking African American soldier in the Union Army during the Civil War, was the grandson of Muslim slaves. Neither Douglass nor Bailey ever participated in a slave revolt. One of the reasons why they lived to tell their stories and become the great leaders that they did. As a matter of fact, in 1859, when Connecticut-born radical abolitionist John Brown was planning his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, Frederick Douglass met with Brown in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, was convinced that there was no possibility that it would succeed, and therefore refused to join the doomed effort. Nevertheless, it is possible that both Frederick Douglass, it's possible with Douglass, it's certain with Delaney, certainly the two most famous African-American men of the Civil War era, one definitely had Muslim ancestors, the other might have. Escaping slavery. It was very, very difficult, but occasionally it was done. In 1816, a group of prominent white men, including future Secretary of State Henry Clay, a slave owner from Kentucky, met to form something called the American Colonization Society, an organization that sought to gather former slaves and free African Americans and transport them back to Africa. Their motive was transparently racist. Most African Americans hated the idea, and in 1829, David Walker, a free African American in Boston, wrote a pioneering abolitionist tract titled Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, in which he denounced colonization in the strongest language possible. Nevertheless, until the end of the Civil War, about 40 years later, for some white men, colonization was the solution to the problem of slavery. They wanted to free the slaves and send them back to Africa. When Abraham Lincoln, an admirer of Henry Clay, rose to national attention in the 1850s, he was an outspoken proponent of colonization. As late as his annual address to Congress in December 1862, President Lincoln stated, "I cannot make it better known than it already is that I strongly favor colonization." To reiterate, most African Americans oppose colonization, but this is again an interesting point in Dr. Diop's book. It appears that some Muslims, especially first and second generation slaves, were more receptive to the possibility than slaves from families that had been in the United States for generations. She provides several anecdotes about freed Muslim slaves who accomplished this feat, that is, being freed from slavery and returning to Africa in the middle decades of the 19th century. The best example probably is a 67-year-old slave named Ibrahima Abd al-Rahman, who in 1829, after 42 years as a slave in the United States, returned to Africa, arriving in what became the Republic of Liberia shortly before his death. In addition, Martin Delaney, about whom I spoke a few minutes ago, certainly was the son of at least one Muslim grandparent, maybe more, and he was one of the very few prominent African Americans of his generation to speak in favor of some former slaves embracing their African past and returning to their roots. Let me try to draw a couple of these themes together very, very quickly.
Dave, I think you're going to need to sort of just finish it.
I will go to the end.
We don't have much time, so.
Okay, thank you. I recommend this book as a very important contribution to the academic literature of slavery. It's marvelous, well worth the effort, and it's not an easy book to read just because of the difficulty of the information, but it's well worth reading. In conclusion, I cannot improve upon Dr. Diop's brief final paragraph. The African Muslims may have been in the Americas the slaves of Christian masters, but their minds were free. They were the servants of Allah. Thank you very much.
Those things, the three major religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, I believe they all kind of worship the same God. So you talked a little bit about, Allah is the one God and stuff like that. But how do Muslims determine who's, why is there, if we're all worshiping the same God, why is there kind of friction?
Well, the way it would work out is that there are three people of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All believe in one God, but what happens is that, for example, Islam sees that Christianity sneaks in polytheism through the Trinity. Okay? So that we have that as an issue that they say they understand what Allah would want, but misinterpreted in that way. With Judaism, you have the community, which is wonderful, but it misses also an aspect. I'm trying to remember exactly. But each one is partial that came before Islam, and Islam is therefore with Muhammad as the scribe, the messenger of Allah, is the completion of the insights that come from Abraham, from Jesus, up to Allah, the Quran, the perfect mirror of Allah's oneness through Muhammad.
In mentioning that, I know this is historic and, with the history of Islam, could there, or is really a question to the faculty, could there also be, the same thing, but also the history and culture of Judaism, and then the history and culture of Christianity? In planification, just like this is the history and culture of Islam. I mean, I would like to see and hear that same symposium or defense.
Do you want the next symposium then?
Yes, to be
The
one of,
comparative history of Christianity and Judaism. It certainly is a possibility, and that does exist, and there are writings on it, scholars who study it. And again, we are trying to approach it from the historical point of view, and separate the historical from the theological. But the theological is part of it. As Professor Griffith indicated, the impact of Greek philosophy impacted on Christianity, it impacted on Judaism, and it impacted on Islam, because the way of thought that was represented there was so powerful that groups that were cognizant of those systems of thought began to look at their own religious experience through those categories and began to say, what applies, what doesn't apply, right? Does Plato apply to us? The theory of the forms, right, that exist in an ideal world. Neoplatonists, okay, put those ideas in the mind of God. But again, this is about Islam, and so we can't do it all. And in fact, I would add this. As much as we have tried to do here, we have brought in marvelous different facets of it. We've only scratched the surface. There's no one here talking about Islam and art. Although Jacek, when he was showing us some of the architecture, did get into the art forms, right? Science, the impact of Islam on science, right? The Abbasid dynasty, the impact on mathematics. So there are broad areas that we try to do as much as we could, right? But you're asking us to go too far afield. Other questions? Maya,
You mentioned during your speech that Islamic slaves would carry Christians through the ways and do different stuff. Can I set that?
there are dozens in this book. That's what I recommend you look at.
Okay, we had another question over here.
I don't exactly know what Mecca is, but I know what Mecca is talking about.
Okay, and you've been here the hour before, right? I sort of went over that, the Arabian Peninsula. Mecca is on the camel caravans from Yemen in the south of the Arabian Peninsula up to the markets of the north, Cairo, Damascus, this kind of thing. And Muhammad's tribe became wealthy through the control of that camel caravan, right? Which will become a source of conflict inside Mecca when a person like Muhammad begins talking about monotheism as the only true form of belief, which means literally in a tribal society, in public, he says, my grandfather is in hell because he didn't believe in one true God. Okay, which alienated, members of his own family, his own tribal group, and this kind of a thing, right? So Mecca is in Saudi Arabia. Medina, the other holy city, was an oasis to the north. Okay, but Muhammad and his mother had relations up there and goes up and goes up.
Professor McCullough wanted to put in that series and we'll wrap up.
Huh?
Do you want any comments on the next question?
No, I had a question.
Oh, it does? All right. Should we take one more question?
You go ahead.
All right, one more question and then we'll
I have a question for Professor Vincent. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the lecture, so it might have come up. But was there enforced Christianity? Was Christianity enforced on the slaves when they arrived? And names also changed so that some of the traces were sort of eradicated?
The answer is absolutely. There was a vigorous effort, and I believe all of the colonial traditions to force Muslim slaves to convert to Christianity. But Dr. Diaz's phrase is that those were often pseudo-conversions, that they superficially accepted the slave masters' religion because they had no choice about that. But one of the remarkable things about the practice of Islam in the Americas was how persistent it was. Often not for several generations, but especially in the first and second generations. They might have, as I say, superficially accepted Christianity, but they continued their traditional Muslim practices.
All right. Yes, let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.